Welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. My name is Catherine Hillis and I am a student here at the UCSD School of Global Policy and Strategy, studying environmental policy in Latin America. Today's panel is hosted by the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy under the Center's Global Leaders Forum. Some of you may recall the last Global Leaders Forum event with former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Our topic of discussion today is Mobilizing Climate Financing for a Sustainable Future, and we have a very special guest joining us today. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to introduce our host, Renee Bowen. Professor Bowen is the Director of the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, as well as a professor and Pastor Faculty Fellow here at UCSD. She is jointly appointed at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Department of Economics. She serves on the California Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. Our guest today is the Most Honourable Andrew Holness, Prime Minister of Jamaica. Prime Minister Holness is the youngest person to become Prime Minister in Jamaica's history, first taking office when he was 39 years old. Before becoming Prime Minister, he served as Minister of Education and has remained focused on improving literacy rates in the country. For a period that includes Prime Minister Holness's time in office, an IMF case study reports that the combination of commitment to reform from all walks of society, political, public, and private sector, as well as strong support from international and bilateral partners, has provided Jamaica a historic opportunity to reverse its course from unsustainable policymaking to setting an example for other small countries on how to take a crisis and convert it into an opportunity. Currently, Prime Minister Holness co-chairs the UN Climate Change Financing Initiative with President Emmanuel Macron, where he works to mobilize climate financing as part of the Paris Agreement. Welcome, Prime Minister Holness. We're excited to have you and look forward to our discussion. Before turning things over to Professor Bowen, I would like to mention a few housekeeping notes. For the first 40 minutes, Professor Bowen and I will pose questions to the Prime Minister, after which we will take questions from the audience. The audience is encouraged to write questions in the Q&A portion of your screen at any time during the session. During the Q&A period, we will try to answer as many questions as possible. The session will have a hard stop at 5 p.m. With this, I will now turn it over to Professor Bowen.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. We are absolutely delighted to have Prime Minister Andrew Holness joining us. The one thing Catherine neglected to mention in my bio, and probably most important for today, is that I am Jamaican. So I'm slightly invested and biased in how excited I am for this event. So before I jump into questions, I'd like to give Prime Minister Holness an opportunity to mention a few things and we can get right into questions. Prime Minister Holness, thank you so much for joining us. Please take the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. You notice I've started off with my mask. The pandemic is still the backdrop for everything that we do. I want to, first of all, thank the University of California, San Diego, and in particular, the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy through its director and today's host, Professor Renee Bowen, Jamaican, for putting on this very timely forum. Special greetings to all your students and your virtual audience. Even before the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, the world was off track from staying within the global warming limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius. 2019 was the second warmest year on record. Carbon dioxide levels and other greenhouse gases rose to new records in 2019. And even while emissions dropped last year due to the economic slowdown, emissions are expected to rise to higher levels once the global economy begins to recover, perhaps putting us well on track for a global temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius and beyond. What does this mean for climate vulnerable countries? Well, it means that the devastating effects of climate change are just beginning and are projected to get worse. Millions of people are directly impacted by extreme weather events every year, and important sectors of our economies continue to be threatened by climate-induced hazards, jeopardizing the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals and future prosperity and security of all, particularly the poorest and most vulnerable. The pandemic and the climate crisis have significantly changed the global economic context in the past year, with huge implications for climate finance. We are now faced with two crises, the pandemic and the climate crisis, that needs to be addressed simultaneously. The causes underlying both overlap and are rooted in human activity. Both are inherently global in nature and will require coordinated, synergistic, and strong global responses. The global macro-fiscal context has worsened substantially in the past year, especially in developing countries, precisely when the need is greatest for climate finance to drive urgent transformational action. There is less money available to respond. Many countries, particularly in the developing world, have large fiscal deficits to fill and are facing sovereign debt crises. While this represents an enormous challenge, the pandemic has also created possibly a one-off, last chance opportunity to rebuild economies at the pace and scale that the crisis requires. The pandemic has served as a wake-up call for many, highlighting fragilities and inequity, but also demonstrating the capacity of humans to work in collaboration, care for each other, and act collectively. We have a unique opportunity to build stronger and build better and build together by shifting to a growth model that is climate aligned, resilient, sustainable, equitable, and inclusive. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you, Prime Minister. That was really a great introduction, setting up the difficulties we're facing right now. So I'd like to reflect a little bit on Jamaica in particular, as a developing country, as an island nation, particularly vulnerable to climate change. I'd love to hear sort of your particular experience with this, how climate change is going to affect you as a nation. And then what is it specifically that you have in mind to do with Emmanuel Macron as part of the UN Climate Finance Initiative? Our listeners would be very curious to hear how those plans are going and sort of some of the challenges having to do with those plans.
Question: how is climate change impacting Jamaica? The average Jamaican would experience climate change and attribute weather events and the changing in how they experience weather as part of the impact of climate change. Just last year, we had significant rainfall in 2 tropical storms. And within the Caribbean region, we have experienced certainly more intense and more frequent hurricanes and significant weather events. So damage to infrastructure, sea level rise, coral reef destruction, that would be the greatest impact for the average Jamaican experiencing climate change. But we also experience it from a fiscal point of view because all of these events make it very difficult to keep your budget on track. Once one of these weather events occur, and if they occur with greater frequency, then your ability to plan becomes very difficult. So we have had to restructure the way in which we put our budget together to actually set aside resources as a kind of self-insurance for these kinds of weather events that you can't plan for, these 1 in 100-year events that seem to happen every 10 years. In terms of what we've been doing with President Macron and others in the UN climate financing initiative, it's mostly about advocacy. And in 2019, we had several developed nations increasing their commitments to putting more resources into the climate funds. The challenge, of course, is that a centerpiece of this whole business of climate financing is the agreement, I believe it was in 2009, that the world would be very ambitious to set aside $100 billion for climate financing. It's important because it is a sign of solidarity of the rich countries with the poorer countries who are having the impact of climate change, and that the world is serious about funding the necessary changes, both in terms of adaptation to ensure that we can meet the target of staying within the limit of 1.5. We have not yet met that 100 billion. I'm not certain what the outtake for 2020 would be, but I doubt that we would meet the 100 billion per year. But it still remains a goal. It is still an ambitious goal, and I believe that the world is still committed to it. As to whether or not we would be able to allocate more resources, given all that has happened with the pandemic, for now, that is yet to be seen.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine for the next question.
Yes, thank you, Professor Bowen. And thank you, Prime Minister, for explaining all the effects Jamaica is experiencing, and then also the complex international relations going on here as well. And so speaking of climate financing, part of what Jamaica has done for its adaptation and mitigation efforts has worked with the Green Climate Fund, which for our listeners is an organization dedicated to helping developing countries reduce emissions and respond to climate change. And so do you see the fund as effective, and do you think it needs to make any improvements? And if so, what are some improvements you may suggest?
Well, Jamaica has a very good relationship with all our international and bilateral partners, and specifically with the Green Climate Fund. And I've personally visited the Green Climate Fund, participated in various seminars and fora that they have held, and they mean well. They do reach out, they do lean forward to support developing countries, and they do provide funding. Jamaica, I believe, would have benefited to the tune of about $2 million in capacity development, capacity building support. For small countries, accessing the Green Climate Fund might pose a challenge because it does require understanding the system that has been put in place to develop projects and to ensure that the projects are aligned with the goals of the Green Climate Fund. From what I have seen, what I've heard from colleagues around the region, it has been a challenge in accessing resources.
Thank you. So I just want to follow up on that a little bit. And you mentioned 2009 that commitments were made. There have also been more renewed commitments to fulfilling pledges by developed countries, and you've acknowledged that you've received some assistance through the Green Climate Fund. I'm kind of curious if you could recommend any further steps to make the Green Climate Fund or to make other such initiatives a bit more effective for developing countries and countries such as yourselves. You mentioned in your opening remarks that we're still quite far off our climate goals that we set out. So just wanted to hear from you what you think could be some steps to take to improve this.
You know, in a sense, countries like Jamaica, small developing states, would have to acknowledge that the capacity to develop the projects that would fit and align with the goals are not always in place. And so the first step in a fund like the Green Climate Fund, which is a relatively new fund, would be to build the capacity within these countries. And that process is ongoing. I'm hoping that within another year, 3 years or so, that we would have that capacity institutionalized. And then we would transition from developing capacity to actually using that capacity to drive projects that can be financed. Because it's one thing to be able to develop the projects on paper. You really then need to be able to identify the projects at home and bring all the moving parts. And it can be quite a complex thing, especially if you're going to do sizable projects, large-scale projects that are going to have meaningful change.
So I'd kind of like to follow up on that. So when you reference capacity building, can you give a specific example of what you have in mind? I think at a high level, our audience understands what that means, but in terms of actually implementing these projects, and it may be specific to Jamaica, it might be that this capacity varies from country to country, but at least in particular for Jamaica, what capacity might be used?
I give you a perfect example. That, you know, we now have in the structure of our government a division in our Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, a section that deals wholly and solely with climate change as distinct from environment. And their job now is to, one, understand this new landscape, participate in the global climate diplomacy that takes place, to have a presence in the fora in which decisions are being made about commitments and allocations and so forth, and then to take that back, bring it into the country so that it gets fed and mainstreamed into our activities here. So that is a whole bureaucracy by itself. And then to ensure that whatever we're doing, climate is mainstream. So if we're going to do infrastructure, then we start to think about what are the climate risks to the infrastructure that we have. That takes a certain capacity building. You're going to need people who have actually gone to the University of California, San Diego to study issues on climate change. And
we have lots of those, by the way.
Well, my point is made. So it does take some time to build that capacity, both from the project writing end, from the administration end, from the financing end, from the engineering and design end. It's an entire ecosystem that has to be created.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for responding to that. I'll turn it over to Catherine for the next question.
Yes, thank you so much for giving that detailed answer. And so typically when we're talking about climate financing, as we have been, we think of it as flowing from developed governments to developing governments. But you've also spoken about the need for the private sector to contribute to this. So why and how should private companies be involved? And how is the UN Climate Financing Initiative motivating them to commit funding? And then also, do you see a role for trade agreements in facilitating any of these incentives?
You know, first, you've said when we talk about climate financing, it's mostly the flow from developed countries to developing countries. And necessarily it has to be that way. The truth is that small island states, developing countries like Jamaica, we stand relatively to bear a greater cost of climate change, whilst contributing very little, minuscule, to the problem. So if there is going to be a balance or any equity, then the flow necessarily has to be that way. And there is also the greater sense that for the last 100 years or so or more of industrial development, there has been, before the emergence of climate thinking, a massive rush for resource extraction and exploitation to develop. Now we have this new consciousness about how that past 200 years of industrialization has had an impact and is currently having an impact on the environment. So countries need to slow down. So a country like Jamaica, contemplating its own development, must now build in to its development framework that it can't exploit resources in the way that rich countries have exploited resources in the past. There's a cost to that. And that is indeed the debate for other larger developing countries that make that point. But having said that, a part of the new consciousness is not just being more sensitive and understanding the impact of resource extraction and exploitation on the environment. It is also understanding that there has to be a flow of resources to support developing countries in utilizing their resources in a sustainable way. So I think that needs to be clearly stated and understood. The second point is, why should the private sector get involved in this? And how do we get the private sector involved in sustainable development? You know, it's an interesting point of view that if you were to ask conscientious Americans or Europeans, you know, would you invest in a company that is polluting? I would venture a guess to say maybe 80 to 90% of those investors would say, no, I wouldn't invest in a company that is polluting. So the issue then is, how do we get the private investor, whether it is a large hedge fund or someone just putting aside their pensions, to match what they value in terms of principles with their value in terms of economic resources. And that requires a higher level of consciousness. It requires far more public education that we have. It requires discourse like this, and then it requires government incentives. In other words, governments have to act with a certain level of determination and instrumentality to structure the regulatory environment and the incentives that they give to direct private resources towards more sustainable economic activity. And then they have to enlist the support of the enlightened consumer by giving far more information that exists now. You know, the bond markets and so on, the equity markets, they get quite a bit of information from rating agencies, and investors follow that. But you don't have a public league table to say, here are the companies that are investing sustainably and smartly and are matching what your values are to what your economic value is. So you don't have that. So these are things that need to be done. And it can only be done by having this enlightened discourse, but by also getting governments to act with determination and instrumentality.
Thank you. That was really a great response. I think the call to action by private entities is really not something we hear a lot about. It's often dealt with at the intergovernmental level among executives. And I think you made an also great point about educating the public. So I wanted to change gears just a little bit. You mentioned earlier the need for cooperation in climate finance, and also thinking about how this extends to trade agreements and just shifting global alliances. Some of our audience would know that tomorrow the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy is hosting a significant conference on the future of the global trading regime. And of course, we can't talk about global trade without talking about climate and needs for cooperation on climate. So I just wanted to sort of probe a bit more. What do you see as sort of that link between trade agreements and climate? There's certainly lots of opinions on whether or not trade agreements should be linked to climate. But I'm curious if you've thought about this, especially from a developing country context, and especially in light of your comments that developing countries are probably suffering the most from climate change, but are actually the least in terms of the offenders.
And could probably suffer even greater in trade.
That's right.
If it is that a regime were established without having a context as to trade and development. So it's absolutely important that if you're going to talk about, managing trade from a climate perspective, that could also have a negative impact on a developing country, that you do have these resources in place so that our production can be aligned sustainably. So it can't be argued in a vacuum. The $100 billion per year has to be in place to support developing countries to transition to newer technologies, newer production modalities, to look into new areas so that they can trade goods that are sustainable.
Thank you so much for that answer. Catherine, I'll turn it over to you for the next question.
Yes, so speaking of international cooperation, President Biden just announced that he plans to halt US funding for overseas fossil fuels projects. And this seems like a step in the right direction, but some are concerned that this provides an opening for other countries with lower climate standards, like notably China, to step in and provide this funding. What do you see as the pros and cons of this move?
Again, ultimately, so it's one thing to stop funding for high carbon emitting energy sources, but the complementary move would also be to increase funding for low carbon emitting technologies, low carbon emitting energy sources, and to help developing countries to transition away from high carbon emitting sources. So I think we always have to be comprehensive in our outlook. We really need to take a Marshall Plan-like approach to the developments when we talk about climate change, because you can't deal with the itemized issues in a silo: trade, energy, rise in the oceans. You literally have to take all of them together, and on top of that, sort out the financing, because it is really a reconfiguration of the world's economy. And once you start to think of climate change in that way and the financing, then I think you start to find the answers to all the other issues that we are treating with individually.
So I'm gonna leave my script for a second and again, drill down a bit more into that. So Jamaica as a developing country, I'm sure has had some support from the Chinese government. And I'm sure that's been welcome support, but from the United States perspective, there's some cautions there. And I'm just curious, as the Prime Minister of a developing country, how you balance those relationships, especially in light of the increasing tensions between the United States and China. How do you think about further investments from the Chinese, and whether this is something that is putting a strain on your relationship with the United States?
Well, Jamaica is a small country, but we're also an independent country. And to a large extent, our markets are integrated very much into the United States. And that is by virtue of proximity, history, and people. So you know, Jamaica will always be very open, very close, and always integrated into the United States market. But Jamaica has also had a long-standing relationship with China. And we have had that relationship beneficial to both countries, beneficial in trade and infrastructure development. And China has made available to Jamaica resources through grants and otherwise that we have used for the benefit of the country. There are concerns raised in various quarters about the geopolitics, the issues involved, but Jamaica believes in a multilateral system, and Jamaica believes very strongly in having our relationships being transparent, and we see ourselves as you know, a part of the global community. So we you know, whatever investments that we have, whatever deals that we have, they're all transparent. We try to keep them so that they can stand to any scrutiny. And we respect the relationship we have with the United States and the relationship we have with China.
Great, thank you so much for asking that. And Catherine, I'm going to preempt you a bit and switch gears since we're running a little short on time, and we'd love to get to all the comments in our Q&A. So I wanted to highlight a little bit of the successes of the Jamaican economy. Your administration, as Catherine mentioned in her introduction, certainly has come a long way. The country has come a long way under your administration in terms of reforms, in terms of market reforms. But to some extent, the increased growth hasn't quite played out. Personally, as an economist, I'm always thrilled to see the reforms that are happening in Jamaica. And we can also say, well, COVID came along. Certainly, there are many other factors that have absolutely nothing to do with the actions of any particular administration. So I just wanted to sort of ask you about how the country's handling the pandemic. How do you see the pandemic affecting the economy?
You know, there is a dividend to be had from good governance. There's a dividend to be had from good fiscal management, and Jamaica is experiencing the benefits of having that dividend of 10 years of good fiscal management, of building in buffers into our economy to withstand shocks. This is something that for the last 40 years we were not able to do, whether it was the oil price shocks of the 70s, whether it was the collapse of the financial markets, whether it is a hurricane or whatever other issues may occur in the global economy, or through environmental and climate change issues, we would not have been able to withstand it. And the end result of that would have been a ballooning in our debt. But that ultimately was a matter of policy. How do we choose to respond to shocks? How do we arrange our public finances? We changed our policy stance 10 years ago, almost. And we embraced IMF recommended reforms. We internalized them. We made them our own reforms. And now they are enshrined in our laws. And I would dare say they are a part of the political landscape now. They are part of our economic thought, right? They are part of the political economy, as economists would like to call it. We have not been successful as we would like to have been in growth. That is not to say that we have not achieved growth. We have been hovering at just under 2%, between 1% and 2% for the last 6 to 5 years, thereabout. That has been, for many economists, a puzzle. Why is it that we haven't cracked that 2% ceiling as yet? And there are many reasons for that. One of them is we needed to move faster with the institutional reforms. that would create the regulatory environment that would unleash the potential of our private sector. That is ongoing, and we need to increase that. And the other thing is we needed to have increased our infrastructure investment. And last year we had a record in infrastructure investment. Unfortunately, COVID came and we had to reallocate from that, but we're still on a good trajectory and we should get back to that. So if we get these two things right, which is the increased institutional reforms, which will enable us to increase our implementation capacity for greater infrastructure development, we should be able to crack that 2% and then put us on the way to take off.
Wonderful. So I think to close out our question period, Catherine might want to ask something relevant for students here. Catherine, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, so this is very personal to me, and I'm sure other students listening in on this call. But if students want to truly make a difference on climate change, what advice do you have and what careers do you recommend they pursue?
Well, it's a broad question, obviously.
Deep sigh.
But you can make a difference in any career you choose for the climate. If you're in law, if you're in finance, if you're in engineering, if you're in energy, you can take a climate perspective. And that is, one, what am I doing to reduce my own carbon footprint? What am I consuming? How many flights am I taking? What kind of car do I choose to drive? What kind of government am I going to elect? So it's all, look, you're only going to fix this climate business by fixing the consumer. That's what it comes down to. You know that old story of the magazine that was ripped up, and the only way to put it back together, one part of the page had the globe and the other part had a man. And so you put the man together and you flip it around and the globe will be put back together. And that's the story. If we get our act together as human beings, more conscious, more enlightened perspective on how we live, regardless of the career we choose, we should be able to make an impact on climate change.
Great. That's a wonderful way to close out this formal section. So we're going to turn to our question and answers. And I see that we have lots of questions here. And please keep putting those questions in the Q&A box. So I'd like to start out with a question from Professor Paul Niehaus in our economics department. And he says, Prime Minister Holness, thanks for being with us today. And I want to thank you again. You mentioned the fact that you still feel a need to self-insure to some extent against extreme weather events. What scope do you see for the stronger international financial facilities to ensure sovereign states like yours against extreme weather events? And potentially to link those financing arrangements to social insurance schemes within the country?
Well, we have to do both things, right? So we have to set aside an emergency fund, and that is what we've started to do. So in our fiscal arrangements, we do set aside a certain percentage of our budget each year. But we've also taken advantage of cooperation with our friends bilaterally and multilaterally to have bought into various insurance schemes around the world. And we have, I believe this year we've received a payout from one of those insurance arrangements for flooding that we had as a result of two hurricanes that came back to back, two tropical storms rather that came back to back. So yeah, we take both approaches, which is to set aside and then to invest in insurance schemes.
Great. So thank you for that. And a similar question from another wonderful professor, Christopher Costello. And sorry, I'm a little partial to The Economist here. And he asks, how can we use climate finance to build resilience and mitigate climate change at the same time? For example, should we consider financing investments in resilience with a price on carbon? Of course, that's come up quite a lot. Is carbon pricing really the solution to mitigating climate change?
Well, if I'm answering an economist, I would say yes. You need a market-based solution in many respects for this, and a price would be the best signal. But the price would obviously have to help to internalize the externality. So it would have to take into consideration the impacts of climate change. So yes, my answer to that would be yes.
Excellent. As an economist, I approve of that answer. So I'm also going to turn to another professor of ours, not an economist. She's a scientist, a physicist, Jennifer Burney, Professor Jennifer Burney. She's also right here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. She says, I was delighted to hear you mention Antisiloization. That's a difficult one to say. This seems like a critical issue in two ways: adaptation and mitigation costs borne in one sector and controlled by one minister, potentially, but might have benefits mostly accrued in others. In terms of risk management, this is critical. But how are you thinking about this and overcoming the siloization issue in Jamaica? I think you touched on this a little bit, but can you tell us more about that?
We have one Department of Climate Change that deals with everything. It's very small. So it's not that we deliberately try to take a comprehensive approach, but our resources forced us into that position where we have to use our limited resources to treat with all the issues. And for us, an important strategy is mainstreaming how we view climate change issues. So that helps to have everything, in a sense, connected, from the mitigation end, from the risk analysis end, and from the adaptation end, the projects that we're going to put in place. All of that is mainstreamed right throughout all the ministries. So I wouldn't say that we have a silo perspective on the climate change issues.
That's really encouraging to know, and probably a lesson that other countries can take note of. And speaking of cooperation, to what extent is Jamaica and the Caribbean countries through CARICOM cooperating on climate change mitigation?
You know, the CARICOM group is very, very active in climate change issues. And our main work would be through the UN bodies, and in particular, the Small Island Developing States, SIDS. And that's where we do most of our work.
Thank you for that clear answer. And so I should have mentioned that question came from Gonzalo Lopez. Professor Peter Gurvich, emeritus and the former dean at GPS, asked the question, how would you have designed the energy market in Texas to avoid the disaster they had? And how would you have gotten it politically accepted? What is your plan? So obviously you have your priorities, and Texas's market is not likely one of them. But any comments you might have on the situation in Texas?
You know, I'll have to send you my bill if I give you my answer. You know, I was actually very surprised by the impact of the weather on not just energy, but all the utilities, I gather, suffered. And that's something that we have to look at very, very closely here in Jamaica. What lessons we can learn from what happened in Texas, because obviously that was a really unplanned event on such a nature, on such a scale that you could hardly think that the utility companies would plan for that, but that is the issue. You now have to consider in everything that you're doing the eventuality of that 100-year event happening within the decade.
I'm sure that's a lesson many developing countries, and indeed many countries, developed or developing, can take from you. A question comes from Rafael Pastor. You understandably said that smaller emerging countries can't afford to contribute as much money as larger countries. Do you expect larger countries, US, China, Japan, Germany, etc., to contribute pro rata based on their GDP or some other metric?
Well, I think a transparent metric would be how much you pollute. That's where to start. How much you pollute, and everyone is required to contribute to climate change. In Jamaica, we're contributing by building out our carbon sinks, by planting out more trees and so forth, and we're putting in an energy policy that is looking towards increasing the percentage of renewables. So every country in the world should contribute in that way. What they're doing positively towards reducing the carbon output. And then those who have contributed significantly to carbon output and have benefited from it, they're gaining economically from it, they have large reserves in funds sitting down, should use that then in a positive way to make the world sustainable and resilient.
So that's a very nice incentive compatible mechanism, as in you have incentives to reduce pollution if you're in fact paying for how much you're polluting. So that's a very nice proposal. So I wanted to, let's see, there are a few more questions in the chat. But we have about 9 minutes left in the session. I wanted to see if my co-host Catherine had any more questions for you, and then just allow about 5 minutes to you to sort of wrap up.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Professor Bowen. I just wanted to get a sense of your overall optimism for the work you're doing with the UN and what type of response you feel you're getting from developed nations, and if you think anything in the future could change that.
Well, in my line of work, you realize that nothing is going to happen overnight. And global energy is usually directed at the greatest immediate threat. So right now, the entire world is focused on the pandemic and recovering from the pandemic. The issue is how to ensure that we recover more resilient, we recover smarter, and we recover in a more climate-aligned way. So that's the effort right now. As it relates to any allocation of resources for climate change, the conversation continues. And I'm sure that there are countries that will continue to make their contributions and commitments, though some have already indicated that it will be reduced.
That again was a great answer. Thank you so much for being so clear. So we have a little bit more time to go to one more question, I believe, from our chat. So this question comes from Jamel Banton. It's not so much a question as a comment, but I'm going to rephrase it as a question. So in Jamaica, he comments that you've seen more intense rainfalls. Many inner city communities exist on the banks of gullies, and drainage and infrastructure needs improving. And of course, as the climate continues to change and we have more of these 1 in 100-year events, that's going to be particularly harmful for these inner city communities. In terms of Jamaica, and maybe you can even comment on how other developing countries might handle such a thing. How are the impacts of climate change really being addressed in some of these, some of the poorest communities? And I just want you to also reflect on the fact that, as you said, the developing countries are being affected significantly more than developed countries, and they're the ones doing the less pollution. And similarly, it's these poorer communities that are probably most affected by climate change, and again, are probably doing the least damage to the environment.
Well, everything that we do now, certainly as it relates to physical infrastructure, housing and commercial development, we build into it the issues of climate change. And it is now not just a theoretical and academic conversation to the average Jamaican about this thing called climate change that might seem distant and removed from them. They're seeing it now as a real threat. We are now developing policy to translate that kind of public understanding into public policy about relocating our citizens who live in low-lying areas, in areas that are threatened by ocean sea level rise, people who live on marginal lands that are threatened by changing river courses. So we are incorporating that into our physical infrastructure development, but also into our fiscal budget. So we are actually making a budgetary allocation based upon climate change to address this.
That's really wonderful to hear. Since we have just one more minute, I'm going to take one more minute to make note of another comment in our chat. Again, not so much a comment and not so much a question as it is a comment, and it might help you in your climate goals. It says, "Dear PM Holness, I'm a friend of Monte Carlo, and I know that Prince Albert, through his foundation, is a huge supporter of the environment, especially related to the sea. Which of course surrounds Jamaica. Has Jamaica communicated with him?" So I'll just make it a little bit broader. To what extent has Jamaica communicated with private citizens who might be interested in assisting with?
Well, send me his number. Let me start with that. No, but we have a very active NGO, civil society sector that does quite a bit of work interacting with private foundations and private citizens who have interests in the environment. So I would not be surprised if some entity out of Jamaica has. I'm not certain whether or not Jamaica government official has done that, but we certainly would look into it, yes.
Great. And I will just allow you now a couple minutes to wrap up and say any final comments.
Yes. The world is looking to recover, and the recovery will be rapid. So I'm optimistic. You'd ask me about my optimism. I think it will be rapid. In a very ironic way, the pandemic had kind of slowed down carbon emissions, but the recovery might very well increase it. So it is now for governments to think long and hard about what kind of recovery we're going to have. So the recovery has to be smart, it has to be sustainable, but it also has to be equitable. And the issue of equity, again, came up when we were discussing the allocation of the $100 billion to help to strengthen the developing world to be resilient to climate change. But now we see the same issues, of course, with vaccines. So it might be a situation where, again, the developed world recovers much faster than the developing world because of access to vaccines. So we can't really have a conversation about saving the world without speaking about equity.
That's a really great note to end on. Prime Minister Holness, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an incredibly informative conversation, and we've been having lots of thank yous in the chat for your candor. And so again, thank you everyone who participated in this webinar. And if you're looking for another Global Leaders Forum, we have Jeff Immelt joining us tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp Pacific time. And we look forward to him talking about supply chains in the global economy. Catherine, if you have any final words, I'll turn it over to you just to wrap up.
Yes, I just want to say thank you, Prime Minister, for joining us and giving such insightful and interesting answers about Jamaica's position and all the work you're doing. And thank you, Professor Bowen, for hosting and everyone for attending. We really appreciated all the great questions.
And thank you for being a great
Thank you.
host. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.